Now, these stories are all from the past year since the protests. You watch the news, but if you don't know some of them, if some of those names and details are unfamiliar, that may be because so much of this is treated by our system, even after all this, as normal. So that even after the intense protests and a moment when more white Americans appeared to gain consciousness about a well-known fact of life in over-policed communities, during a moment where people did march or they did post online and big corporations touted that Black Lives Matter. But as the months go on and people go back to living life like it's normal, if they live the kind of lives that allow them to just forget about all this, to pretend it's not there. Now, civil rights leaders and activists, they sense this would happen because these are old and entrenched dynamics in American history and law and racism. If you listen to activists, you'd hear them literally anticipate this before it happened. Right here's an earlier picture during the protests of an activist urging people then support us when it's not trending, when it's not the hot topic online or social media or politics. Because you cannot fix multi-generational systemic problems with episodic spasms of effort, even well-intentioned. Now, if we stay on these facts, even when they're not trending, what does this period show us about solutions? Well, that brings us to the final part of this special report. First, this recent activism and scrutiny alone are not bending the curve of police shootings in America. That's just a fact. I'm not talking about whether we like it or not, but that's what this year and that chart shows. Now, an observer might have thought or hoped that a year like the one we just lived through would impact some officers' conduct. But when it comes to shootings, in the aggregate, it did not. Second, some valid policy reforms are also failing to bend that curve. Whether we like that or not, we should know the evidence. So there are more body cameras, which can add to the type of mechanisms that law enforcement oversight needs. But in this past year, as I showed you, they're not reducing shootings. Tonight, in fact, among some of the few examples we chose out of the many available, we saw stories where police just unilaterally turned off their body cameras. Now, part of my job on the news is to just be straightforward. Have you ever seen surveillance video at a bank which could just be flipped off by any visitor or bank robber? That would kind of defeat the point. So when videos do incriminate the police, what happens? Well, even when they exist, the departments often hide them. In one study, the majority of incidents caught on body cameras were never released by police. So some of these reforms won't work very well if they still depend on the original issue here in American policing, which, again, not every country does it this way, on the premise that police should just police themselves. That brings me to a third and final point. Some reforms do have an impact when they assert truly independent authority over police. Reforms to patrol the police work better if someone other than the police has control of what happens. That's why citizen videos very clearly have an immediate impact. The police do not have control with them in the first place. The video of George Floyd's murder went viral swiftly, so fast the police were still stupidly, falsely claiming that Floyd died in a medical incident, a cover story that was shredded by the public video. People forced facts into the system that otherwise would never have come to light. Same goes for reforms where independent prosecutors investigate these allegations against police instead of the DAs that are usually on the police's team. There's also a plan the police unions are fighting the hardest to stop, which is to reform the legal immunity that prevents courts from ever finding facts in the first place. Right now, under the law, most cases against police are actually tossed before getting to a trial because of this type of immunity. So the alleged victims don't even get a day in court. If police are caught in alleged misconduct, like take a case we brought you, Colorado police handcuffing and detaining unarmed women and children at gunpoint, unarmed in broad daylight. So it was very hard to see why those kids would pose that kind of threat. And the question legally becomes, is there accountability for that conduct? We brought you that case earlier. It never gets easier to watch. Police admitted in that instance that it was a case of mistaken identity. They apologized in public, and legally, that's where these cases typically end because police immunity prevents the family from suing. But here is a model for some change that occurred in real life in the past year. In Colorado, it's one of just 4 states that actually limited police and officer immunity. So now the courtroom door is a little more open for that mother to sue in civil court, which she did, alleging racism, among other things. The only reason she gets her day in court is because she actually lives in one of the few places that has reformed police immunity in this past year. Now, nationally, that's still one of the huge sticking points for Republicans opposing the George Floyd Act, which did pass the House but is stuck in the Senate. So those are some policy implications. What we do know is that this shooting rate remains steady with a disproportionate number of minorities getting shot or killed by police. So that's the same as last year. If we want to change this, which a lot of people and companies claimed they did last year, then again, my job here as a newscaster is pretty simple. I can just report for you that as policy, by definition, we would have to do more as a country than what's happened over the past 4 years, the past year, because this whole thing is holding steady. And while most of what we've covered in this report tonight focuses on the category of police killings, that's this chart, keep in mind there's the even more common issue of extensive and allegedly excessive use of police force in America. Our police officers send over 50,000 people a year to the ER on average. That approaches 500,000 visits since 2015, according to a CDC count. I told you at the beginning of this, we were just going to go through the evidence and the facts. That's all this is. This is what's going on. These stories grind on whether they're covered or not, whether the system notices or not. And while the last year did provide some scrutiny and progress and change, any person or corporation that claimed to care then should logically care now because the numbers haven't budged. The killing rate is just as bad now as it was when people were posting passionately after the murder of George Floyd. This is the same America with the same rate of police shootings and killings. These are real lives. These are black lives lost. And while the rare conviction of that officer for murder was significant, and people saw him led off in cuffs to serve time, that rare conviction is not the goal of this BLM movement, according to many of its leaders. It's also not the goal of a functioning justice system. Now, why do I say that? Again, listen to the civil rights leaders. They've been telling us the goal is not to send more people to prison for the unnecessary illegal killings of innocent people. The goal is to stop the police killings of innocent people in the first place. And if those people's lives mattered last summer, then they matter now. And until we actually change this and keep up with the overall evidence, we'll be left with spasms of outrage for the very worst moments that are sometimes arbitrarily caught on tape. But you can't fix a problem like this in moments or hours. We're dealing with a problem of years, centuries. Stories do help people see the reality. But the reality is unfolding in years and years of government conduct, and most of it is not on tape. So you have to go back to that steady line. It's on the same pace this year. Now, this is not a time for told you so's, but people did tell us. They did challenge Americans at the time. Support us when it's not trending, as one protester put on record on that sign. Another says we are not a trend. Black lives still matter. And that's right. It's not a trend. It's people's lives, human lives that matter. And this police epidemic is way worse than a trend. And we can't begin to fix it until we face it.